Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Sleep Stories TV. Tonight, in our Greek mythology series, we journey into Theseus and the Minotaur's labyrinth. Athens trembles under a monstrous curse, but a hero named Theseus rises to face the darkness. If you haven't subscribed to Sleep Stories TV, join us now. Hit that bell and don't miss a single myth. Now let's step into the story where courage meets the maze and destiny unfolds. While other heroes fought against fate or pride, the story of Theseus is an epic of one who fought for the honor and future of his city. In the sun-drenched hills of ancient Greece, where myths were born from the whispers of gods and the courage of mortals, Theseus emerged not as a solitary warrior chasing personal glory, but as a beacon of hope for Athens, a city burdened by a curse that stained its pride. Unlike Achilles, whose wrath burned for his own honor, or Odysseus, whose cunning was forged in survival, Theseus's tale is rooted in duty, a selfless drive to lift his people from despair. Athens, a cradle of culture and ambition, lay under a shadow cast by Crete, a powerful island kingdom ruled by King Minos. Every 9 years, the Athenians were forced to pay a gruesome tribute. 7 young men and 7 young women, the finest of their youth, sentenced to a horrific fate in the jaws of the Minotaur. This was no mere monster story, no fable to frighten children in the dark. It was a living nightmare, a ritual of blood that drained Athens of its future. The Minotaur, a creature born of divine wrath, half man, half bull, lurked in the depths of a labyrinth so intricate that none who entered ever returned. This was the price of a long-ago wrong, a debt Athens paid for the death of Minos' son, Androgeus, killed in a moment of reckless pride. Minos, unrelenting in his grief, demanded this sacrifice, and Athens, too weak to resist, bowed to his will. The city's streets, once alive with song and debate, grew heavy with dread as the 9th year approached. Mothers wept, fathers cursed, and the youth chosen for the tribute carried the weight of a city's shame. Yet into this gloom stepped Theseus, a young man whose name would echo through time. He was not born in Athens' marble halls, but in the rugged wilds of Troezen, raised in secrecy, the son of King Aegeus, yet unknown to his father until fate called him home. Theseus was no ordinary youth. His strength was matched only by his resolve, and his heart burned with a vision of Athens restored. When he arrived in the city, he found not a kingdom of triumph, but a people crushed by fear. The tale of the Minotaur was no distant legend to him. It was a wound in the heart of his home. He could not stand idle while his city bled. Where other heroes might have sought glory in battle or immortality in song, Theseus saw a higher purpose: to break the cycle of sacrifice, to free Athens from its chains, and to prove that a hero could fight not for himself, but for the soul of a nation. His decision to face the Minotaur was not born of arrogance or thirst for fame, but of a deep, unshakable love for his people. He was not yet king, but he carried the weight of one, knowing that the path ahead would test not just his body, but his spirit. The story of Theseus is not merely one of swords and monsters, but of a man who dared to challenge fate itself, not for his own sake, but for those who had no voice to cry out. It is a tale of sacrifice, of courage in the face of impossible odds, and of a city that found hope in the heart of one man. As Theseus prepared to embark on his journey, the people of Athens watched with a mixture of awe and fear. Would he succeed where so many had perished? Could one man, however brave, defeat a beast born of divine vengeance? The answer lay not in the strength of his arm, but in the fire of his will. Theseus stood before the ship that would carry him to Crete, its black sails a grim reminder of the fate awaiting him. Yet in his eyes burned a light that no darkness could dim. He was not just a warrior, not just a prince, but a symbol of what Athens could become: a city free, proud, and unafraid. And so, with the weight of his people's hopes upon him, Theseus stepped aboard the ship, ready to face the labyrinth, the monster, and the destiny that awaited. This was no mere adventure. It was a battle for the future, a fight to reclaim honor from the jaws of despair. As the ship sailed toward Crete, the horizon held not just danger, but the promise of redemption. For Theseus, this was the moment when a hero was born not in the clash of steel, but in the quiet resolve to stand for something greater. The story begins with the shame of Athens. Every 9 years, they had to send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete to be sacrificed to the Minotaur, a monster half-man, half-bull. This was no mere tale whispered in the agora, no myth to be debated by philosophers under olive trees. It was a grim reality, a wound that bled the city dry year after year, generation after generation. The origins of this curse lay in a tragedy, a moment of hubris that had spiraled into a debt of blood. Long before Theseus set foot in Athens, King Minos of Crete, a ruler whose power stretched across the Aegean, had sent his son Androgeus to compete in the games of Athens. Androgeus was no ordinary prince. His skill and strength outshone all competitors, and the Athenians, stung by envy or fear, allowed him to be struck down in a moment of treachery. Some say he was ambushed by rivals, others that he was sent to face a monstrous bull and met his doom. Whatever the truth, his death ignited Minos' wrath, a fury that burned hotter than the Cretan sun. Minos, favored by the gods, called upon Zeus to unleash vengeance. The gods answered, plaguing Athens with famine and pestilence, until the city's oracles delivered a bitter verdict to appease Minos, and the divine wrath Athens must pay a tribute. Not gold, not treasure, but the lives of its youth, 14 souls chosen by lot, sent every 9 years to Crete, where they would face the Minotaur. This creature was no ordinary beast, but a living curse born of divine punishment. Minos' wife Pasiphae had been driven by Poseidon's spite to fall into an unnatural love, and from that union came the Minotaur, a creature with the body of a man, but the head and ferocity of a bull. Imprisoned in the labyrinth, a maze so complex, it defied the human mind, the Minotaur devoured all who entered. The labyrinth was the work of Daedalus, a genius whose architectural mastery made escape impossible. Its twisting corridors, its endless dead ends were as much a prison for the monster as for its victims. For Athens, the tribute was a ritual of despair. Every 9 years, the city gathered at the docks, watching as their sons and daughters, barely past childhood, boarded a ship with black sails, a funereal banner that signaled their doom. The streets fell silent, save for the wails of families torn apart. The chosen youths were not just sacrifices. They were the city's future poets, warriors, thinkers, lovers, all destined to vanish into the dark. The shame of this tribute weighed heavily on Athens, a city that prided itself on wisdom and courage. How could a people who birthed democracy, who carved marble into gods, submit to such a barbaric demand? Yet Minos' navy was unmatched, his power unyielding, and Athens had no choice but to comply. The cycle of sacrifice had become a chain binding the city to its past sin. Each tribute was a reminder of failure, a public humiliation that eroded the spirit of a proud people. The elders spoke of it in hushed tones, as if the very mention of the Minotaur might summon its shadow. The young, meanwhile, grew up under the specter of the lottery, knowing that any one of them could be chosen to face the beast. The Minotaur was not just a monster. It was a symbol of Athens' subjugation, a living proof of their weakness before Crete. And yet, in this darkness, a spark of defiance was about to ignite. The arrival of Theseus, a prince unknown to his people, would challenge the very foundations of this curse. He saw not just the horror of the tribute, but the deeper wound it inflicted on Athens' soul. Where others saw inevitability, Theseus saw injustice. Where others saw fate, he saw a chance to rewrite it. As the 9th year approached once more, the city prepared for another grim procession. The black-sailed ship waited in the harbor, its hull creaking under the weight of sorrow. Families clung to their children, praying their names would not be drawn. But this time, something was different. A young man, broad-shouldered and resolute, stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Theseus, the son of Aegeus, had come to break the cycle, to face the monster, and to restore Athens' honor. The shame of the tribute would no longer define his city. As he looked out at the sea toward the distant shores of Crete, he carried with him the weight of every life lost, every tear shed, and every hope crushed. The story of Athens' shame was about to become the story of its salvation. Theseus, the long-lost son of King Aegeus, who had just returned, could not stand to watch his city suffer this humiliation, and volunteered to be one of the tributes. The air in Athens was thick with despair, the weight of the 9th year pressing down like a storm cloud. The black-sailed ship loomed in the harbor, a grim specter ready to carry another 14 souls to the jaws of the Minotaur. Families clung to one another, their faces etched with fear, as the lottery's cruel hand plucked the names of the young men and women destined for Crete. The city, so proud of its philosophers and poets, stood powerless before the might of Minos, its spirit crushed under the weight of a debt it could not repay. Into this scene of sorrow stepped Theseus, a figure who seemed to carry the light of the gods themselves. He was not born in the shadow of Athens' Acropolis, but in Troezen, a distant land, where his mother Aethra had raised him in secrecy. His father, King Aegeus, had left him as an infant, placing a sword and sandals beneath a great boulder, with a promise when Theseus was strong enough to lift the stone he could claim his birthright. Years had passed, and Theseus grew into a man of unmatched strength and unyielding spirit. When he finally lifted the boulder, retrieving the tokens of his heritage, he set out for Athens, facing trials that would have broken lesser men, bandits, monsters, and treacherous paths. Each challenge forged him further, sharpening his courage and resolve. By the time he arrived in Athens, he was no stranger to danger, but nothing could have prepared him for the city's shame. He found his father Aegeus, a king worn down by years of grief, helpless to stop the tribute that bled Athens dry. The palace, once a place of pride, felt like a tomb, its halls echoing with the ghosts of those sent to Crete. Theseus, though newly arrived, felt the city's pain as his own. He walked among the people, saw the mothers weeping, the fathers staring blankly at the horizon, and the youths trembling as the lottery drew near. To him, this was not just a tragedy, it was an affront to everything Athens stood for. How could a city of wisdom and courage bow to such a barbaric fate? His blood burned with defiance. He would not let another ship sail carrying the screams of his people. In the agora where citizens gathered to debate and mourn, Theseus made his stand. His voice, steady and clear, cut through the murmurs of despair. "I will go," he declared, volunteering to take the place of one of the chosen youths. The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on this stranger, this prince they barely knew. Aegeus, his father, pleaded with him to reconsider, his voice trembling with a father's fear. "You are my son," he said, "returned to me after years of absence. Do not throw your life away." But Theseus was unmoved. "This is not about my life," he replied, "but the life of Athens." His words were not those of a reckless youth seeking glory, but of a leader who saw a path where others saw only darkness. To volunteer for the tribute was to face certain death. No one had ever returned from the Labyrinth. Yet Theseus's resolve was unshakable. He was not driven by pride or a thirst for fame, but by a deep, unspoken vow to restore his city's honor. He looked at the faces of the other tributes, boys and girls, barely past their teens, their eyes wide with fear, and saw not just victims, but the future of Athens. If he could save them, if he could slay the Minotaur, he could break the cycle of sacrifice and free his people from Crete's grip. The decision was not made lightly. Theseus knew the odds, knew the stories of the labyrinth's endless corridors, its walls that seemed to shift and mock those who dared enter. He knew of the Minotaur, a creature born of divine wrath, its hunger insatiable, its strength unmatched. Yet fear did not sway him. He stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, his eyes fixed on the black-sailed ship. The people of Athens watched in awe, their despair giving way to a flicker of hope. Could this young man, this prince returned from exile, be the one to end their suffering? As Theseus prepared to board the ship, he carried not just his own fate, but the weight of a city's dreams. His father Aegeus stood at the dock, his face a mask of pride and terror. The king could not stop his son, but he clung to the hope that Theseus would return. In that moment, Theseus was no longer just a prince. He was Athens itself, its courage, its defiance, its will to survive. As the ship's black sails caught the wind carrying him toward Crete, Theseus stood at the prow, his heart steady, his mind clear. He was not sailing to his death, but to a battle that would define his legacy. The shame of Athens would not endure, not if he could help it. In his anguish, King Aegeus made his son promise one thing: if you return safely, change the black sail of the funereal ship to a white sail of victory. The harbor of Athens was a scene of quiet despair, the air heavy with the salt of the sea, and the sorrow of a city sending its youth to die. The black-sailed ship, its dark canvas a symbol of mourning, stood ready to carry Theseus and the 13 other tributes to the distant shores of Crete. The crowd gathered at the docks, their faces a mix of fear and fleeting hope, watching as Theseus, the newly returned prince, prepared to board. His broad frame stood out among the trembling youths, his eyes fixed on the horizon, unwavering, as if he could already see the labyrinth and the monster within. But behind his resolute exterior, there was another figure, one whose heart was breaking. King Aegeus, aged beyond his years by the weight of his crown and the losses of his city, stood at the edge of the dock, his hands trembling as he faced his son. Theseus was no ordinary prince to him. He was the child he had thought lost, returned after years of separation, only to now risk everything in a battle no one had ever survived. Aegeus had ruled Athens through decades of shame, watching helplessly as ship after ship sailed away with the city's brightest souls, never to return. The Minotaur's hunger was insatiable, and the labyrinth's walls were unyielding. Now his own son, his only son, had chosen to face that same fate. The king's voice, usually steady with the authority of a ruler, cracked as he spoke to Theseus. "My boy," he said, his words carried away by the wind, "you cannot know the pain of a father who has just found his son only to see him sail to certain death." Theseus, though moved by his father's grief, stood firm. "Father," he replied, "this is not about my life, but the lives of all who come after me. If I do not try, Athens will never be free." Aegeus knew he could not sway his son's resolve. The fire in Theseus's eyes was not born of recklessness, but of a purpose deeper than personal glory. Yet the king could not let him go without some thread of hope to cling to. He took Theseus's hands, his grip tight, as if he could hold him back from the sea itself. "Promise me," Aegeus said, his voice low but urgent. "If you slay the beast, if you escape the labyrinth, let me know you live. Change the sails. Let the black sails fall and raise white ones in their place. Let me see victory from afar, so I know my son returns." Theseus nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the promise. "I will, father," he said. "If I return, the sails will be white." It was a simple vow, a small gesture in the face of the monumental task ahead, but to Aegeus it was everything. The black sails had become a symbol of Athens' defeat, a reminder of every life lost to Crete's cruel tribute. A white sail would mean more than Theseus's survival. It would mean the end of the curse, the rebirth of a city's pride. As Theseus stepped onto the ship, the other tributes looked to him, their fear tempered by his presence. He was no older than they, yet he carried himself like a leader, his courage a beacon in the gathering dusk. The ship creaked as it pushed away from the dock, the black sails catching the wind, billowing like a shroud over the sea. Aegeus stood rooted to the spot, watching until the ship was a mere speck against the vast expanse of water. His heart was a storm of pride and terror, hope and dread. He had lost so much to the Minotaur already, not just the youths of Athens, but the spirit of a kingdom that once stood tall. Now his son was his last hope, and the promise of the white sail was the fragile thread that tied him to that hope. The crowd dispersed slowly, their whispers trailing into the night. Some spoke of Theseus's bravery, others of the impossibility of his task. But Aegeus remained, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he could will his son's victory into being. The promise of the sail was more than a signal. It was a covenant between father and son, a bond that stretched across the sea to Crete. Theseus, standing at the ship's prow, felt the weight of that promise. He knew what it meant to his father, to his city. He carried not just his own life, but the hopes of every Athenian who had ever mourned a child lost to the labyrinth. As the shores of Athens faded behind him, the reality of his choice settled in. He was sailing toward a monster, toward a maze that had swallowed countless lives. Yet he did not falter. The promise of the white sail was a beacon in his mind, a reminder of why he fought. Not for glory, not for fame, but for the day when no more ships would sail under black. As the sea stretched endlessly before him, Theseus steeled himself for what lay ahead, knowing that the promise he made to his father would guide him through the darkness to come. Upon arriving in Crete, Theseus and the Athenian youths were faced with the Labyrinth, a maddeningly complex structure designed by the genius architect Daedalus, from which there was no escape. The journey across the Aegean had been somber, the black-sailed ship cutting through the waves like a blade through the heart of Athens' hope. The 13 other tributes, their faces pale with dread, clung to one another as the shores of Crete came into view, its towering cliffs and gleaming palaces, a stark contrast to the fate that awaited them. Theseus stood at the prow, his gaze steady, though his heart carried the weight of his father's promise and the city's desperate prayers. As the ship docked in the bustling harbor of Knossos, the grandeur of Crete unfolded before them. Minos' palace was a marvel, its walls adorned with vibrant frescoes of bulls and dancers, its courtyards alive with the hum of a thriving kingdom. But beneath this splendor lay a darkness, a secret buried deep within the earth. The labyrinth was no mere building. It was a nightmare given form, a maze so intricate it seemed to defy the laws of the world. Daedalus, the architect whose mind rivaled the gods, had crafted it, at Minos' command, not just to imprison the Minotaur, but to ensure that none who entered could ever find their way out. Its corridors twisted and turned, doubling back on themselves, branching into dead ends that mocked hope, their walls cold and unyielding, etched with shadows that seemed to move in the torchlight. The very air within was said to hum with despair, as if the labyrinth itself were alive, feeding on the fear of those who wandered its depths. The Minotaur, the monster at its heart, was a creature born of shame and divine vengeance. Half man, half bull, it was the offspring of Pasiphae's cursed love, a punishment from Poseidon for Minos' hubris. The beast was not evil by choice, but a prisoner of its own nature, its roars echoing through the maze like a lament for its own existence. Its hunger was insatiable, its strength unmatched, and its presence turned the labyrinth into a tomb for all who entered. As Theseus and the tributes were led through Knossos, the Cretan guards watched them with cold indifference, their spears glinting in the sun. King Minos himself awaited them, his presence commanding, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a ruler who held Athens in his grip. He stood on a dais, his robes flowing like the sea, and addressed the tributes with a voice that carried both menace and mockery. "You are the price of Athens' sin," he declared, "and the labyrinth will claim you as it has all others." The tributes trembled, some stifling sobs, others staring blankly at the ground. But Theseus met Minos' gaze without flinching. He saw not just a king, but a man whose grief for his son Androgeus had twisted into cruelty. Minos' vengeance was a chain that bound two kingdoms, and Theseus vowed to break it. The tributes were led to a holding chamber, a cold stone room where they awaited their fate. Whispers filled the air, stories of the labyrinth's terrors, of the Minotaur's savage strength, of the countless youths who had vanished into its depths. Some prayed to Athena for courage, others to Poseidon for mercy. But Theseus remained silent, his mind racing. He knew brute strength alone would not save them. The labyrinth was as much a foe as the Minotaur, its endless paths a puzzle that demanded cunning. He studied his fellow tributes, their faces a tapestry of fear and resignation, and felt a surge of resolve. They were not just victims, they were his people, and he would not let them die. The weight of his promise to his father, the white sail of victory burned in his chest, a reminder of why he had come. As night fell, the palace grew quiet, but the shadow of the labyrinth loomed larger than ever. The tributes were to be sent in at dawn one by one to face the maze and the monster within. Theseus closed his eyes not to sleep, but to prepare. He imagined the twisting corridors, the Minotaur's roars, the moment when he would stand face to face with the beast. He was not afraid, but he was not reckless either. He knew the odds, knew the stories of those who had gone before, their screams, swallowed by the maze. Yet he also knew that he was different. He was Theseus, son of Aegeus, born to lift the curse that plagued his city. The labyrinth was a challenge, but it was not invincible. The Minotaur was a monster, but it could be slain. As the first light of dawn crept through the chamber's narrow windows, the guards came for them. The tributes were led through the palace down a series of steps that seemed to descend into the earth itself. The entrance to the labyrinth loomed before them, a gaping maw of stone, its darkness swallowing the light. The air grew colder, the sounds of the world above fading away. Theseus stood at the threshold, his heart steady, his mind sharp. He was not just entering a maze. He was stepping into the heart of Athens' shame, ready to face the monster that had haunted his people for too long. The labyrinth awaited, and with it the destiny that would define him. But in the darkness of despair, a ray of light appeared. Princess Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos himself, fell in love with Theseus at first sight. The cold stone chamber where the Athenian tributes awaited their fate was a place of shadows where hope seemed as distant as the stars above Crete. The air was heavy with the dread of the coming dawn, when the labyrinth's gates would open, swallowing them into its endless depths. The other tributes huddled together, their whispers a fragile shield against the terror of the Minotaur, whose roars some swore they could hear echoing faintly from beneath the earth. Theseus, though, stood apart, his eyes tracing the patterns in the stone walls, his mind wrestling with the challenge ahead. He knew the labyrinth was more than a maze, it was a trap, designed to break the spirit before the body. Yet even in this moment of quiet resolve, fate was weaving a new thread into his story, one that would change everything. Ariadne, the princess of Crete, had watched the tributes arrive from the shadows of her father's palace. She was no stranger to the grim ritual, having grown up under the weight of her family's curse. The Minotaur, her half-brother, was a secret her father hid from the world, a monstrous reminder of divine wrath and mortal shame. Ariadne had lived her life in the splendor of Knossos, surrounded by beauty and power, but always aware of the darkness beneath the labyrinth, the beast, and the screams of the youths who never returned. She had learned to turn her eyes away to silence her heart against the cruelty of her father's vengeance. But when she saw Theseus, something stirred within her. He was not like the others. Where the other tributes trembled, he stood tall, his broad shoulders unbowed, his gaze steady and defiant. There was a fire in him, a courage that seemed to challenge the very gods. Ariadne felt her heart quicken, not with fear, but with something she had never known before, a pull toward a stranger, a man who carried the weight of a city's hope. In that moment, love struck her like a lightning bolt, swift and undeniable. It was not just his strength or his beauty, though both were undeniable, but the purpose that radiated from him, a determination to break the cycle of sacrifice. Ariadne was torn. To act on her feelings would mean betraying her father, her kingdom, the very order of her world. Yet to do nothing would mean watching Theseus walk into the labyrinth, likely never to emerge. Her mind raced as the hours dwindled, the weight of her choice pressing against her. She was no warrior, no hero, but she was clever, raised in a court where power and intrigue danced in equal measure. She knew the labyrinth's secret, knew its creator Daedalus had left a way to unravel its mysteries, if only one had the key. In the dead of night, when the palace slept and the guards' vigilance waned, Ariadne stole through the corridors, her heart pounding her steps, silent on the marble floors. She found Theseus in the tribute's chamber, his silhouette illuminated by a sliver of moonlight. He turned as she approached, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. "I am Ariadne," she said, her voice steady despite the storm within her. "I know who you are, and I know what you face." Theseus studied her, wary but intrigued, sensing the weight of her words. She continued, her voice low. "I cannot let you die in there. Not you." Her confession hung in the air, raw and unguarded, and Theseus saw in her eyes not just pity, but a fire that matched his own. She was risking everything, her father's wrath, her place in the palace, perhaps her life, to stand with him. Why, he asked, his voice soft but searching. Ariadne hesitated, then answered, "Because you are not like the others. You fight for something greater than yourself." In that moment, a bond was forged, not just of love, but of shared defiance against a cruel fate. Ariadne's decision was a rebellion, a choice to break from the chains of her father's vengeance. She was no mere princess offering a token of affection. She was a partner in Theseus's quest, a mortal offering divine aid. Her love was not a weakness, but a strength, a courage that rivaled his own. As the night deepened, she leaned closer, her voice a whisper. "I can help you," she said, "but you must trust me." Theseus nodded, sensing that this was no trick, no trap laid by Minos. Ariadne's eyes held truth, and in them he saw a glimmer of hope. She spoke of the labyrinth, of Daedalus's genius, and of the monster that haunted its heart. She promised him not just survival, but a chance to triumph. As the first light of dawn approached, Ariadne slipped away, leaving Theseus with a spark of possibility. He stood alone once more, but no longer in darkness. Ariadne's courage had lit a path forward, a way through the maze that had claimed so many. The labyrinth still loomed, its walls as cold and unforgiving as ever, but Theseus now carried something new, the knowledge that he was not alone. Ariadne's love was a beacon guiding him toward the battle ahead, and with it the hope that he could not only survive but change the fate of Athens forever. In a secret meeting, Ariadne gave Theseus 2 life-saving items: a sharp sword and a simple ball of thread that was the key to conquering the maze. The night in Knossos was still the palace, wrapped in a quiet that felt like the calm before a storm. The tributes, locked in their cold stone chamber, awaited the dawn with hearts heavy with dread. The labyrinth loomed in their minds, its twisting corridors a specter that haunted their every breath. Theseus, however, was not idle. His encounter with Ariadne had ignited a spark of hope, a belief that the impossible might yet be within reach. Her words, her courage had stirred something deep within him, not just gratitude, but a sense of partnership in this desperate quest. As the moon cast faint shadows through the narrow window, Ariadne returned, slipping through the palace like a wraith. Her presence was a risk, each step a defiance of her father's rule, but her resolve was unshaken. She carried with her not just the weight of her choice, but the tools that could turn Theseus's courage into victory. In the dim light, she knelt beside him, her eyes bright with determination. "Theseus," she whispered, "the labyrinth is a trap no strength can overcome, but there is a way." She opened her hands, revealing a sword, its blade gleaming even in the faint moonlight, and a simple ball of thread, unremarkable yet heavy with possibility. The sword was no ordinary weapon, forged with care, its edge honed to cut through flesh and bone. It was a gift meant to face the Minotaur's brute power. But it was the thread, so humble in its simplicity, that held the true key to survival. Ariadne explained, her voice low but steady, that the labyrinth's genius lay in its chaos. Its paths twisted and turned, leading wanderers in circles until despair claimed them long before the Minotaur did. Daedalus, the maze's creator, had confided in her a secret, a way to unravel its mystery. "Take this thread," she said, pressing the ball into Theseus's hands. "Tie one end to the entrance and let it unspool as you go. It will guide you back, no matter how deep you venture." Theseus turned the thread over in his hands, its weight light, but its promise profound. It was not just a tool, but a symbol of intellect, triumphing over chaos of preparation, outwitting fate. He looked at Ariadne, seeing not just a princess, but a mind as sharp as the sword she offered. Her gifts were more than objects. They were a lifeline, a bridge between despair and hope. But there was more to their exchange, a deeper bond sealed in the quiet of the night. "I will help you," Ariadne said, "but you must make me a promise." Her voice wavered, not with fear, but with the weight of what she was about to ask. "Take me with you when you leave Crete. I cannot stay here, not after this." Theseus understood the magnitude of her sacrifice. By aiding him, she was betraying her father, her kingdom, her very world. To leave with him was to abandon everything she knew, to step into an uncertain future. He took her hand, his grip firm but gentle, and said, "I swear, Ariadne, if I live, you will come with me to Athens." It was a vow that carried the weight of honor, a promise that bound their fates together. Ariadne nodded, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and resolve. She had chosen her path, and there was no turning back. As she slipped away into the night, Theseus clutched the sword and thread, feeling the gravity of what lay ahead. The sword was his strength, the thread his cunning, and together they were his hope. He thought of the Minotaur, its monstrous form lurking in the darkness, and of the labyrinth, its walls designed to break the spirit. But he also thought of Ariadne, her courage, a beacon that matched his own. Her gifts were not just tools, but a testament to the power of alliance, of trust, forged in the face of impossible odds. As dawn approached, the guards came to lead the tributes to the labyrinth's entrance. Theseus hid the sword beneath his cloak, the thread tucked safely against his chest. The other tributes, unaware of his plan, looked to him with a mixture of awe and desperation. He met their gazes, offering a nod of reassurance, though he knew the burden he carried was his alone. The labyrinth's entrance loomed before them, a dark maw that seemed to swallow light itself. The air grew cold, the sounds of Knossos fading into an oppressive silence. Theseus stepped forward, his heart steady, his mind clear. He thought of his father's promise, the white sail that would signal victory, and of Ariadne's trust, now embodied in the thread he held. This was no mere battle of strength. It was a test of wit, of courage, of the human spirit, against the divine cruelty of the gods. As he prepared to enter the maze, he felt the weight of Athens on his shoulders, the hopes of the tributes beside him, and the love of a princess who had risked everything. The sword would face the Minotaur, but the thread would lead him home. With Ariadne's gifts in hand, Theseus was no longer just a man, he was a hero, armed not just with steel, but with the hope of a new dawn for his people. Tying one end of the thread to the labyrinth's entrance, Theseus bravely advanced into the darkness, following the endless corridors to find the heart of the beast. The stone archway of the labyrinth loomed before him, a gaping wound in the earth, its darkness so absolute, it seemed to swallow not just light, but hope itself. The air was cold, heavy with the scent of damp stone and something primal, something that spoke of blood and fear. The other tributes stood behind him, their breaths shallow, their eyes wide with terror as the Cretan guards pushed them forward. Theseus, clutching Ariadne's thread in one hand and the sword in the other, took the first step, his heart steady, despite the unknown that lay ahead. He tied the thread to a jagged outcrop at the entrance, its thin fibers gleaming faintly in the torchlight, a fragile lifeline in a world designed to devour. The guards sealed the entrance behind them, the grinding of stone against stone, echoing like a death knell. There was no turning back. The labyrinth was alive in its own cruel way, its corridors twisting and turning, branching into paths that led nowhere, then doubling back to mock the wanderer's hope. The walls, smooth and unyielding, rose high above their surfaces, slick with moisture, etched with faint scratches, the desperate marks of those who had come before. Theseus moved forward, the thread unspooling behind him, a silent promise that he could find his way back. The other tributes followed their footsteps, hesitant, their whispers swallowed by the oppressive silence. The darkness was not just physical. It pressed against the mind, whispering doubts, stirring fears of being lost forever. The labyrinth was Daedalus's masterpiece, a puzzle crafted to break the spirit before the Minotaur could claim the body. Every turn seemed to lead to another, every corridor a mirror of the last, until the world felt like a nightmare without end. Theseus's senses sharpened, his ears straining for any sound, a distant roar, a scrape of hooves, anything to guide him to the beast. The air grew thicker, the faint stench of decay mingling with the damp, and he knew he was drawing closer to the heart of the maze. The thread, his only anchor, slipped through his fingers, its steady unraveling, a reminder of Ariadne's trust. He thought of her, the princess who had risked everything, and her courage fueled his own. The tributes clung to him, their fear palpable, but Theseus's presence was a beacon in the dark. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice a low, steady anchor for their trembling hearts. He was no longer just their leader. He was their hope, the one who dared to face what had destroyed so many. The corridors narrowed, the walls seeming to close in, and the air grew warmer, heavy with the musky scent of the beast. Theseus's grip on the sword tightened its weight, a comfort against the unknown. He could hear it now, a low guttural rumble like thunder trapped beneath the earth. The Minotaur was near. The labyrinth seemed to sense it too, its paths growing more treacherous, its dead ends more frequent, as if trying to protect its monstrous heart. Theseus pressed on his steps, deliberate, his mind racing, to keep track of the thread's path. He knew the battle ahead would test not just his strength, but his resolve, his ability to stay clear-headed in the face of chaos. The tribute's fear was a weight he carried, but he would not let it slow him. He had made a vow to them, to Ariadne, to his father, to Athens itself. The labyrinth could twist his path, but it could not break his will. As he ventured deeper, the roars grew louder, more insistent, each one sending a shiver through the group. The Minotaur was no myth, no story to frighten children. It was real, its presence a force that seemed to warp the very air. Theseus's heart pounded not with fear, but with the clarity of purpose. He was not here to survive. He was here to end the curse, to slay the beast that had haunted Athens for generations. The thread trailed behind him, a lifeline that tethered him to the world above, to the promise of freedom. Every step was a choice, every turn a gamble, but Theseus moved with the certainty of a man who knew his fate was his to forge. The labyrinth's darkness was oppressive, its silence broken only by the distant roars and the soft shuffle of the tribute's feet. Yet Theseus felt a strange calm, a sense that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The sword in his hand was ready, the thread his guide, and his heart burned with the fire of a hero. As the corridors widened, the air grew thick with the beast's presence, and Theseus knew the moment was near. The heart of the labyrinth was close, and with it the Minotaur. He tightened his grip on the sword, his thoughts flashing to his father's anguished face, to Ariadne's desperate hope, to the black sails that would one day turn white. The labyrinth had claimed countless lives, but it would not claim him. He was Theseus, son of Aegeus, and he would face the beast not as a victim, but as a warrior for his people. The thread stretched behind him, a path through the darkness, and with each step he drew closer to his destiny. At the center of the labyrinth, a primal battle erupted, and with strength and intelligence Theseus struck down the Minotaur, ending its reign forever. The air in the labyrinth had grown thick, heavy with the musky scent of the beast, its roars now a deafening pulse that shook the stone walls. Theseus moved forward, the thread trailing behind him, like a lifeline, its thin fibers his only tether to the world beyond. The other tributes followed their steps, faltering, their breaths ragged with fear, but Theseus's resolve held them together, a silent promise that they would not face the darkness alone. The corridors widened, the walls parting, as if to usher him toward his fate. The labyrinth seemed to sense the confrontation, approaching its oppressive silence, giving way to a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. Theseus's heart pounded not with fear, but with the clarity of purpose that had carried him this far. The sword in his hand felt like an extension of his will, its blade gleaming faintly in the dim light of the torches that flickered along the walls. Ariadne's thread, still unspooling, was a reminder of her trust, her courage, and the vow he had made to her. As he rounded a final corner, the heart of the labyrinth opened before him, a vast, cavernous chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow, its floor littered with bones, the grim relics of those who had come before. And there, in the center, stood the Minotaur. It was no mere beast, but a creature of nightmare, its massive frame towering over Theseus, its bull's head crowned with horns that gleamed like polished obsidian. Its eyes burned with a feral rage, yet there was something else in them, a flicker of torment, as if the creature knew it was a prisoner of its own cursed existence. Its body, muscled and human in form, rippled with power, its hooves scraping the stone floor, sending sparks into the darkness. The tributes behind Theseus gasped, some collapsing in terror, but Theseus stood firm, his gaze locked on the beast. This was the moment he had come for, the culmination of his journey, the chance to end Athens' shame. The Minotaur let out a bellow that shook the chamber, its voice a primal roar that spoke of hunger and fury. Theseus tightened his grip on the sword, his mind racing, not with doubt, but with the sharp clarity of a warrior who knew his enemy. The beast charged its hooves, thundering against the stone, its horns lowered like spears aimed at his heart. Theseus dodged his movements swift and precise, the training of his youth in Troezen guiding his steps. The Minotaur's strength was overwhelming, its speed, unnatural for its size, but Theseus was no ordinary man. He was not just fighting for his life, but for the lives of the tributes, for Ariadne, for his father, for Athens itself. The battle was a dance of life and death, each move a test of skill and will. The Minotaur swung its massive arms, its fists crashing into the walls, sending shards of stone flying. Theseus ducked and weaved, using the labyrinth's own structure against the beast, leading it into narrow passages, where its size became a disadvantage. Ariadne's thread, still trailing behind him, was a silent guide, a reminder that he could not afford to lose his way. He struck when he could, the sword slicing into the Minotaur's flesh, drawing blood that glistened black in the torchlight. The beast roared in pain, its rage growing, but Theseus was relentless. He was not just a warrior. He was a strategist, using his intelligence to outmaneuver the creature. He baited it, drawing it into a corner, then struck again, the sword finding its mark in the Minotaur's side. The beast staggered, its roars turning to guttural cries, but it was not done. With a surge of strength, it lunged its horns, grazing Theseus's shoulder, tearing through his cloak and drawing blood. Pain seared through him, but Theseus pushed it aside, his focus unbroken. He saw an opening, a moment when the Minotaur's guard was down, and with all his strength, he drove the sword into the beast's heart. The Minotaur let out a final agonized roar, its massive body collapsing to the ground, the stone shaking beneath its weight. The chamber fell silent, save for the ragged breaths of the tributes and the faint drip of blood on stone. Theseus stood over the fallen beast, his chest heaving, his sword dripping with the Minotaur's lifeblood. The creature was no more. Its reign of terror ended, its cursed existence snuffed out. He felt no triumph, only a quiet resolve. The battle had been won, but the war was not over. He turned to the tributes, their faces a mix of awe and relief, and gestured for them to follow. The thread, still taut in his hand, was their guide back to the world above. As they retraced their steps, the labyrinth seemed less daunting, its darkness less oppressive. The Minotaur was dead, and with it the curse that had plagued Athens for generations. Theseus's mind turned to Ariadne, to the promise he had made, and to the white sail that would signal his victory. The battle had been primal, a clash of man against monster, but it was his intelligence, guided by Ariadne's thread, that had brought him to this moment. The labyrinth was no longer a tomb, but a path to freedom, and Theseus led the way, his heart set on the world beyond. Following the life-saving thread, Theseus led the remaining Athenians out of the labyrinth and hastily set sail with Princess Ariadne. The air in the labyrinth's heart was still heavy with the echo of the Minotaur's final roar, its massive form now a lifeless heap on the cold stone floor. Theseus stood for a moment, his chest heaving, the sword in his hand, slick with the beast's blood. The tributes, their faces pale but alight with disbelief, gathered around him, their fear giving way to a fragile hope. The monster that had haunted their nightmares, that had devoured their kin for generations, was dead. The curse of Crete, the shadow that had hung over Athens, had been broken. Yet Theseus knew there was no time to linger. The labyrinth was still a prison, its twisting corridors a threat to their newfound freedom. He turned to the thread, Ariadne's gift, its thin fibers stretched taut across the maze, a lifeline that had guided him through darkness. "Follow me," he said to the tributes, his voice steady, a beacon in the oppressive silence. They obeyed, their steps quickening As they retraced the path, the thread leading them through the maze's endless turns. The walls, once suffocating, seemed to part before them, as if the labyrinth itself acknowledged their victory. The scratches on the stones, the bones scattered in forgotten corners, were no longer omens of doom, but relics of a past now ended. Theseus moved with purpose, the thread his guide, its simplicity a testament to the power of intellect over chaos. He thought of Ariadne, her courage in defying her father, her trust in giving him the tools to survive. Her face was a light in his mind, a reminder of the promise he had made to take her with him, to bring her to Athens, to honor the bond they had forged in the shadow of the labyrinth. As they neared the entrance, the air grew lighter, the oppressive weight of the maze lifting. The faint glow of torchlight marked the way out, and with a final step, Theseus emerged into the open air, the tributes behind him gasping as they felt the sun on their faces. The Cretan guards, expecting only screams from the labyrinth, stood stunned as the Athenians appeared alive and unbroken. Theseus wasted no time. He led the tributes through the palace, their footsteps echoing in the grand halls of Knossos. Ariadne was waiting, her eyes wide with hope and fear hidden in the shadows of a courtyard. When she saw Theseus alive and victorious, her breath caught, and she ran to him, her hands trembling as they touched his. "You did it," she whispered, her voice a mix of awe and relief. Theseus nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "Because of you," he said, and in that moment, their bond was sealed, a partnership forged in defiance of fate. But the danger was not over. Minos' wrath would be swift and merciless if he learned of Ariadne's betrayal. "We must go," Theseus urged, his voice low but firm. Ariadne nodded, her resolve unshaken, and together they led the tributes to the harbor, where the black-sailed ship waited. The night was their ally, cloaking their escape. As they boarded the vessel, the tributes moving quickly, their hearts lifted by the promise of home. Ariadne stepped aboard, her eyes scanning the palace one last time, knowing she was leaving behind her life, her family, her world. Yet she stood tall, her choice made her heart tied to Theseus and the future they might build. The ship pushed off from the dock, its black sails catching the wind, carrying them away from Crete's shores. The sea stretched before them, vast and open, a stark contrast to the suffocating walls of the labyrinth. Theseus stood at the prow, Ariadne at his side, the tributes gathered behind them, their faces alight with the joy of survival. The Minotaur was dead, the labyrinth conquered, and Athens' shame was no more. Yet even in this moment of triumph, Theseus felt the weight of what lay ahead. He thought of his father waiting on the cliffs of Athens, watching for the white sail that would signal victory. The promise he had made burned in his mind, a vow that seemed so simple in the moment, but now carried the weight of a city's hopes. The sea was calm, the stars bright above, and for a moment it seemed the gods themselves were smiling on their escape. Theseus glanced at Ariadne, her face illuminated by the moonlight, and felt a surge of gratitude. Her thread had been his salvation, her courage his strength. Together they had defied Minos, defied the labyrinth, defied the gods' cruel design. The tributes, once resigned to death, now whispered of home, of families they would see again, of a city that would no longer live in fear. Theseus's heart swelled with pride, not for himself, but for what this victory meant for Athens. The ship sailed on, cutting through the waves, each crest bringing them closer to freedom. Yet beneath the triumph, a quiet unease stirred in Theseus's heart. The journey was not over, and the promises he had made to Ariadne, to his father, to his people, would test him in ways he could not yet foresee. For now, though, he stood with the wind at his back, the thread that had saved him safely coiled, and Ariadne's hand in his, a symbol of the bond that had brought them this far. The black sails billowed a reminder of the grief they had left behind, and Theseus vowed to raise the white sail soon to signal not just his survival, but the rebirth of Athens' pride. However, on the island of Naxos, in a mysterious and controversial act, Theseus abandoned the sleeping Princess Ariadne on the shore. The sea stretched endlessly before the black-sailed ship, its waves carrying Theseus, Ariadne, and the Athenian tributes away from the shadow of Crete and its monstrous labyrinth. The air was alive with the salt of freedom, the tributes' voices rising in quiet murmurs of hope, their eyes fixed on the horizon where Athens awaited. Theseus stood at the ship's helm, the wind tugging at his cloak, his heart buoyed by the victory over the Minotaur. Ariadne stood beside him, her presence a quiet strength, her gaze often meeting his, with a warmth that spoke of their shared triumph. She had left everything behind. Her father, her kingdom, her past, to join him in this new dawn, her trust in his promise absolute. The stars above guided their path, and for a moment it seemed the gods had granted them a fleeting reprieve, a chance to savor the joy of survival. But fate, as it so often does in the tales of heroes, had other plans. The ship made landfall on the island of Naxos, a lush, verdant haven in the Aegean, its shores kissed by gentle waves and framed by olive groves. The tributes, weary from their ordeal, welcomed the chance to rest, to feel solid ground beneath their feet. They set up camp under the stars, the crackle of a fire mingling with the soft lapping of the sea. Ariadne, her strength tested by the weight of her choices, lay down to rest, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, her heart still tethered to Theseus. As she slept, her face softened by the moonlight, she seemed at peace, a woman who had defied a king and a monster to stand by the man she loved. Yet in the quiet of that night, something shifted in Theseus's heart. The reasons remain shrouded in mystery, debated by poets and philosophers through the ages. Some say it was the will of Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry, who claimed Ariadne as his own, whispering divine commands to Theseus in the stillness of the night. Others whisper of a colder truth, that Theseus, consumed by the weight of his destiny, chose his city over his heart, fearing that bringing a Cretan princess to Athens might stir unrest among his people. Whatever the cause, the act was done. As dawn broke over Naxos, its golden light spilling across the sand, Theseus made a choice that would stain his legend. He ordered the ship prepared, the tributes roused from their slumber, and quietly, without a word, he left Ariadne sleeping on the shore. The black sails were raised, the ship slipping away from the island, leaving behind the woman who had given him everything, her trust, her courage, her future. The tributes, unaware of the betrayal, focused only on their journey home, their voices rising in tentative songs of victory. Theseus stood at the prow, his face unreadable, his heart a storm of conflicting emotions. Had he acted under divine compulsion, or had he chosen to prioritize his city's future over a personal vow? The sea offered no answers, its waves carrying the ship ever closer to Athens. Ariadne awoke alone, the sound of the surf her only companion. The camp was gone, the fire reduced to ashes, and the ship a distant speck on the horizon. Her heart, once alight with hope, shattered as she realized the truth. Theseus, the man she had saved, the man she had loved, had abandoned her. She stood on the shore, her cries swallowed by the wind, her betrayal a wound deeper than any the labyrinth could inflict. Some say Dionysus descended, then taking her as his bride, lifting her to the heavens as a goddess, her crown immortalized among the stars. But in that moment, Ariadne knew only loss, the sting of a promise broken. Theseus, sailing onward, carried the weight of his choice, though he could not yet fathom its cost. The tributes, sensing a shift in their leader, kept their distance, their joy tempered by the shadow that clung to him. Naxos faded into the distance, a green jewel in the sea, but its memory would haunt Theseus forever. He had slain the Minotaur, freed Athens from its curse, but at what price? Ariadne's thread had led him out of the labyrinth, but it could not guide him through the maze of his own conscience. The act was controversial, even in his time a blemish on a hero's tale, a reminder that even the greatest victories come with flaws. As the ship sailed on, Theseus's thoughts turned to Athens, to his father, waiting on the cliffs, to the white sail he had promised to raise. But the weight of Naxos lingered, a quiet ache that would not fade. He had chosen duty over love, or perhaps divine will over mortal bond, but the choice was his, and its consequences would ripple through his story. Ariadne, left behind, became a figure of myth in her own right, her tale one of sacrifice and betrayal, yet also of divine redemption. For Theseus, the journey home was no longer just a return, it was a reckoning, a moment when the hero's glory began to fray at the edges. The sea stretched before him, vast and unforgiving, and as Naxos vanished from sight, Theseus stood alone with his triumph and the shadow of a promise broken. And in the rush of his escape or the turmoil of abandoning Ariadne, Theseus made a fatal mistake. He forgot to change the black sail. The sea stretched endlessly before the ship, its waves carrying Theseus and the Athenian tributes closer to home, their hearts lifted by the triumph over the Minotaur. The air was crisp, the wind steady, pushing the vessel through the Aegean with a promise of freedom. The tributes, once resigned to death, now whispered of their families, of Athens's sunlit hills, of a future no longer shadowed by Crete's curse. Yet Theseus stood at the prow, his face a mask of resolve, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had done. The island of Naxos was now a fading memory, its shores lost to the horizon, but the image of Ariadne sleeping peacefully as he left her behind clung to him like a specter. Whether it was the will of Dionysus or a choice born of his own ambition for Athens, the act of abandoning her had left a crack in his victory. He had slain the beast, freed his people, but at the cost of a broken promise, a vow to the woman who had made his triumph possible. The tributes, unaware of the turmoil within their leader, rejoiced in their survival, their voices rising in tentative songs of homecoming. But Theseus's mind was elsewhere, tangled in thoughts of duty, of love, of the price of heroism. The black sails above him billowed their dark canvas, a stark reminder of the grief that had marked their departure from Athens. He had promised his father, King Aegeus, a simple gesture to replace those black sails with white ones, a signal of victory, a sign that his son lived. It was a vow made in the heat of farewell, a father's desperate plea for hope, and Theseus had sworn to honor it. Yet now, as the ship cut through the waves, his thoughts were scattered, his heart weighed down by the choices he had made. The rush of their escape from Crete had been chaotic, slipping away under cover of night, evading Minos' guards, ensuring the tributes were safe. The turmoil of leaving Ariadne, whether by divine command or his own decision, had clouded his mind, and in that storm of emotion, the promise of the sail slipped through his fingers like sand. He stood at the helm, gazing at the horizon, where the faint outline of Athens' cliffs began to take shape. The tributes gathered around him, their faces alight with the joy of survival. But Theseus felt a growing unease. The black sails, unchanged, loomed above like a dark omen. He meant to give the order to call for the white canvas to be raised, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Naxos, to Ariadne's trusting eyes, to the thread that had saved them all. The weight of his betrayal pressed against him, and in that distraction, the simple task of changing the sails was forgotten. The sea, indifferent to human vows, carried them onward, each wave bringing them closer to home and to a tragedy none could foresee. In Athens, King Aegeus stood on a cliff overlooking the sea, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his heart tethered to the promise his son had made. Every day since Theseus's departure, he had climbed that rocky outcrop, his aging frame bent against the wind, searching for a glimpse of white sails. The black sails had become a symbol of Athens' shame, a reminder of the youths sent to die in the labyrinth. A white sail would mean everything, not just his son's survival, but the end of the curse, the rebirth of a city's pride. Aegeus clung to that hope, his prayers whispered to the gods, his eyes straining against the glare of the sun. The tributes, unaware of the oversight, continued their songs, their voices carrying over the water. Theseus, lost in his thoughts, failed to notice the black sails flapping above their dark silhouette, stark against the sky. He thought of his father, of the joy that awaited in Athens, of the crown he would one day wear. But the memory of Ariadne lingered, her absence, a quiet ache that dulled his triumph. Had he done right by leaving her? Was it the gods' will or his own fear of what her presence might mean for Athens? The questions gnawed at him, and in that turmoil, the simple act of changing the sails slipped further from his mind. The ship drew closer to Athens, the cliffs now clear, the city's white walls gleaming in the distance. The tributes cheered, their voices rising like a tide, but Theseus's heart grew heavier. Something felt wrong, a nagging sense that he had overlooked something vital. He scanned the deck, the tributes, the sea, but the black sails above went unnoticed, their dark folds blending into the chaos of his thoughts. The promise to his father, so clear in the moment it was made, had been lost in the whirlwind of escape and betrayal. It was a mistake, a small oversight born of distraction, but its consequences would be catastrophic. The sea carried them ever closer, the black sails a silent harbinger of tragedy. Theseus, standing at the prow, felt the weight of his choices, but he could not yet see the cost. The triumph over the Minotaur, the escape from the Labyrinth, the breaking of Crete's curse, all of it was about to be overshadowed by a single careless error. The white sail, a symbol of hope and victory, remained furled below, while the black sails carried them toward a fate that would echo through the ages. Theseus's heart was set on Athens, on the homecoming that awaited, but the shadow of his mistake loomed larger, with every wave a quiet prelude to the sorrow that would soon unfold. From a cliff in Athens, King Aegeus saw the black sail approaching in the distance, and believing his son was dead, he threw himself into the sea in despair. The sun hung low over the Aegean, its golden light glinting off the waves, casting a warm glow over the cliffs of Athens. For weeks, Aegeus had climbed this rocky outcrop, his aging frame bent against the wind, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Each day he carried the weight of a father's hope, clinging to the promise Theseus had made: white sails for victory, black sails for death. The city below buzzed with anticipation, its people whispering of their prince's quest, some daring to hope that the curse of the Minotaur might finally be broken. Aegeus, however, felt only the ache of a father separated from his son, a son he had barely known before sending him to face a monster. The black sails had haunted his dreams, a symbol of Athens' shame, of the countless youths lost to Crete's labyrinth. He had watched them sail away too many times, each departure carving a deeper wound in his heart. But this time was different. This time it was his son Theseus, the boy he had lost, and found the prince who carried the city's future on his shoulders. Aegeus's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the cliff, his eyes straining against the glare of the sea. He prayed to Athena, to Poseidon, to any god who might listen, begging for a glimpse of white canvas, a sign that his son lived. The promise of the white sail was more than a signal. It was a lifeline, a fragile thread tying him to hope. As the day wore on, a speck appeared on the horizon, a ship cutting through the waves, its form growing clearer with each passing moment. Aegeus's heart leapt, then faltered as the sails came into view. They were black, dark, as the grief that had plagued Athens for generations. The sight struck him like a physical blow, his breath catching in his throat. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible against the wind. The black sails, unchanged, carried the weight of death, of failure, of a son lost to the labyrinth's depths. Aegeus staggered his knees, buckling his hands, clutching at the rock, as if it could anchor him to hope. But the sails did not waver, their dark folds, a cruel confirmation of his worst fears. Theseus, his only son, the hero, who had vowed to free Athens, was gone. The king's mind raced, replaying the moment of their parting. Theseus's steady voice promising the white sail, his eyes burning with resolve. Had it all been for nothing? Had the labyrinth claimed him as it had so many before? The sea, vast and indifferent, offered no answers, its waves crashing against the cliffs below like a chorus of mourning. Aegeus's vision blurred with tears, his heart breaking under the weight of loss. He had sent his son to face a monster, knowing the odds, knowing the stories of those who never returned. The black sails were a verdict, a final judgment on his hope, his faith, his love. In that moment, the world seemed to collapse around him, the cliffs, the sea, the sky, all fading into a haze of despair. He could not bear it, the thought of Theseus dead, of Athens doomed to endure its curse forever. With a cry that tore from his soul, Aegeus stepped to the edge of the cliff, his eyes fixed on the black sails, now so close he could see the ship's outline. There was no hesitation, no final prayer. The grief was too great, the loss too final. He threw himself forward, plunging into the sea below his body, swallowed by the waves that would later bear his name, the Aegean Sea, a monument to a father's despair. On the ship, Theseus stood at the prow, unaware of the tragedy unfolding. The tributes cheered as Athens's cliffs came into view, their voices rising in joy at the sight of home. But Theseus's heart was heavy still, tangled in the turmoil of Naxos, of Ariadne's abandonment, of the choices that had brought him here. The black sails above went unnoticed, their dark canvas blending into the chaos of his thoughts. It was not until the ship drew closer, until he saw the figures on the shore, that a cold realization struck him. The sails. He had forgotten the sails. His promise to his father, so simple, so vital, had slipped through his fingers in the rush of escape, in the weight of his betrayal of Ariadne. He shouted for the crew to lower the black sails, to raise the white ones, but it was too late. The cliffs were empty, the figure of his father gone. As the ship reached the harbor, word spread of Aegeus's fate. The king, believing his son dead, had leapt to his death. Theseus fell to his knees, his triumph shattered by the cost of his oversight. The tributes, their joy turning to sorrow, gathered around him, their voices silenced by the weight of the tragedy. The black sails, meant to be a temporary symbol, had become a harbinger of loss. Theseus's victory over the Minotaur, his escape from the labyrinth, his breaking of Crete's curse, all of it was now tainted by a mistake so human, so small, yet so devastating. The sea that had carried him home now bore his father's name, a reminder of the price of his error. Theseus stepped onto the shore, his heart a storm of grief and guilt, knowing that his greatest triumph had come at the cost of his greatest loss. Theseus returned in the glory of a savior, only to face the tragedy of a grieving son becoming king of Athens, in mourning an eternal lesson that the greatest victory can be overshadowed by a personal failure. The harbor of Athens buzzed with a strange, bittersweet energy as the ship docked its black sails, now a grim reminder of a promise forgotten. The tributes, their faces once alight with the joy of survival, stepped onto the shore. In silence, their triumph dulled by the news that had swept through the city like wildfire. King Aegeus was dead, his body lost to the waves, his life extinguished by the sight of those black sails that Theseus had failed to change. The people of Athens gathered at the docks, their cheers for the returning hero turning to gasps of sorrow as they learned of their king's fate. Theseus, the prince who had slain the Minotaur, who had broken the curse of Crete, stood before them, his broad shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow with grief. He was no longer just a hero. He was a son who had lost his father, a man whose victory was now a shadow cast by loss. The city, so long burdened by the shame of the tribute, should have been alive with celebration. The Minotaur was dead, the labyrinth conquered, and the cycle of sacrifice ended. Yet the air was heavy not with joy, but with the weight of a tragedy that cut deeper than any monster's claws. Theseus walked through the streets of Athens, the tributes trailing behind their steps, slow, their voices muted. The people watched him, some with awe, others with pity, their whispers a mix of gratitude and sorrow. He had freed them from Crete's grip, had given them back their future, but at what cost? The sea, now called the Aegean in honor of his father, was a constant reminder of his mistake, a simple oversight, a forgotten promise that had led to a catastrophe. Theseus's heart was a storm of guilt and pride, of triumph and despair. He had faced the labyrinth, outwitted its endless corridors, slain the beast that haunted his people's nightmares. He had carried Ariadne's thread, her sword, her trust, and with them he had brought hope back to Athens. But the memory of Ariadne left on the shores of Naxos clung to him like a wound that would not heal. And now the loss of his father, caused by his own negligence, was a burden he would carry forever. As he ascended the steps to the palace, the weight of the crown he would now wear felt heavier than any sword. Aegeus's throne, once a symbol of hope for a reunited father and son, was now a seat of mourning. Theseus stood before it, his hands trembling, his mind replaying the moment he had forgotten the sails. How could something so small, a piece of cloth, a color unchanged, have led to such devastation? The people of Athens looked to him, their savior, their new king, expecting strength, expecting leadership. But Theseus felt the fragility of his own humanity, the flaws that made him more than a myth, more than a hero. He was a man, and men make mistakes. The story of Theseus and the Minotaur was no longer just a tale of triumph. It was a lesson etched in blood and loss, a reminder that even the greatest victories come with a price. The tributes, now safe in their homes, told stories of Theseus's courage, of the thread that led them out of the beast that fell beneath his sword. But they also whispered of the black sails of the king who leapt from the cliffs, of the hero who returned not in glory but in grief. Theseus as king would go on to shape Athens into a city of legend, a cradle of democracy and wisdom. He would lead with strength, forge alliances, and build a legacy that echoed through the ages. But the shadow of this journey, the Minotaur, Ariadne, Aegeus, would never leave him. Each time he looked to the sea, he saw his father's face, heard the crash of waves that bore his name. Each time he thought of love, he saw Ariadne, her trust betrayed on a distant shore. The glory of a savior was his art. So too was the sorrow of a son, a lover, a man who had faltered at the moment it mattered most. The myth of Theseus is not one of unblemished heroism, but of a man who dared greatly and paid dearly. It is a story of courage, of intellect, triumphing over chaos, of a city lifted from shame. But it is also a story of human failure, of promises broken, of consequences that linger long after the battle is won. Theseus stood before his people, his voice steady as he addressed them, promising to lead, with the same resolve that had carried him through the labyrinth. But in his heart, he knew the truth: no victory is absolute, no hero without flaw. The Aegean Sea stretched beyond the city, its waves a constant reminder of the cost of his journey. As king, he would carry Athens forward, But as a man, he would carry the weight of his choices, the thread, the sword, the sails, the love left behind. The story of Theseus and the Minotaur is a testament to the power of human will, but also to its limits. It teaches that greatness is not in perfection, but in the courage to face the consequences of one's actions, to rise from failure, to lead through grief. Theseus, king of Athens, stood at the dawn of a new era, his legend forever tied to a triumph that was both glorious and tragic, a victory that saved a city but broke a heart. And so, dear friends, we leave Athens mourning as Theseus's triumph is shadowed by loss. The Minotaur falls, the labyrinth conquered, but the cost of victory lingers in the heart. The Aegean whispers of sacrifice, its waves carrying lessons of courage and failure. Thank you for joining us on Sleep Stories TV. If you loved this tale, subscribe and hit the bell. Share your thoughts below. What do you make of Theseus's choices? Until next time, let the stars guide your dreams.